Hi, and welcome back to Beginning Fly Tying Part 3. I'm Raj Kletke, and today we'll be looking at dubbing, using materials that we've attached to the hook, and tying on some wings. Let's start with dubbing, which is extremely common in tying flies. Dubbing material comes in numerous colors, different fiber lengths, various mixtures, often with bright materials, and of course you can always make your own. To dub the material to the thread, I very seldom use wax, but I commonly use some water on my thread to help with dubbing. After wetting the thread, I obtain a small amount of dubbing. A common mistake is to try to put on too much dubbing at one time, so only put on a small amount at a time. You can always add more as needed. Spread the dubbing thinly along the thread and then spin the dubbing and thread together by rolling your index finger and thumb against one another. Do this in one direction only. I spin in a clockwise direction, looking down from above, as theoretically this tends to slightly tighten the dubbing as you wrap it, but actually it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. As you wrap, you may need to continue spinning the dubbing if you want to keep it thin. You don't always have to spin the dubbing tightly. If you want a loose body, you can go looser with the dubbing as I've done here. But if you want a very loose and spiky dubbing, use a spiky dubbing mix and use a dubbing loop, which we won't be discussing here. Next, we'll forward wrap materials, which is in the same direction that you've been winding the thread, away from you over the top and towards you beneath the hook. I like a rotary vise and feel that a lot of these techniques are easier with a rotary vise. However, in this series, I'll try to show how to handle materials with a fixed vise, which of course can work with a rotary vise also. If you have a rotary vise or are interested in exploring benefits of a rotary vise further, be sure to watch my series on rotary vise techniques, which is on this same YouTube channel. I'm using my loose dubbing here and forward winding it. Continue winding the thread with dubbing as you've been doing with the thread all along. If there's excess dubbing as you get to the tie-off point, usually you can just pull the excess dubbing off your thread. Sometimes the excess dubbing doesn't fully cooperate, such as here, and you may need to trim it with your scissors, but this is fairly rare. Occasionally, you may have way too much dubbing or it's too tight to easily pull off the excess. Then you may want to form a loop. Tie the loop off and relock your thread before cutting the excess loop of dubbing. Once you have the loop cut off, you can continue with the fly in the usual fashion. As I mentioned before, when I'm going to forward wrap materials, I like to start the material on the far side of the hook, so the first wrap starts going under the hook shank. Wind your thread to the tie-off point, and then wind the material by exchanging hands and keeping the thread out of the way. Here I'm keeping using my right middle finger to keep the thread out of the way. Once you reach your tie-off point, hold the material in your right hand while you loop the thread over the material once or twice. You can then put tension on the thread and finish the tie-off wrapping with your right hand before cutting the excess material off from above the hook. Here I'm using the back of my right hand to keep the thread out of the way while I wind the material similar to the previous example. I start the tie-off wraps in the same way as before, and again can finish them as before, cutting off the material at the top of the hook. I also wind the classic hackle in a forward direction. We've previously tied the hackle on top of the hook. Usually I make the bare stem long enough that the fibers don't start displaying until the far side of the hook, as usually I want the most fibers on the side and beneath the hook shank. There are exceptions to this. The pattern and what kind of water you'll be fishing determine how many wraps you want before you would tie it off. Some flies use a palmered hackle. To palmer a hackle, the hackle is usually tied in near the back of the hook and then body material is laid down. I like to put one wrap of body material behind the hackle as I think this gives a neater fly. However, this is personal preference. Wrap the hackle similar to what we did previously, but wind it in loose spirals forward to the tie-off point. You can vary how loose or tight you want the spirals. It's common to put a few tight wraps of hackle just behind the tie-off point. You can then tie off in the usual fashion and cut the excess hackle above the hook. Here I have pheasant tail fibers as the body material on the far side of the hook and a wire for a rib on the near side. I generally try not to use hackle pliers to hold material as I wind materials in, as picking up another item slows tying down. So I'm using the pinch method of wrapping materials. Note again that the first wrap starts going under the shank. Here you pinch the material to the far side of the hook to prevent it from unwrapping as you exchange hands. When I get to the tie-off point, I'm tying the fibers off similar to the other material in this particular video, but often I'll use a pinch tie off, which is a little faster and can be seen in my rotary vise techniques. We're ready to reverse wrap the rib next. Reverse wrapping, also known as counter wrapping, helps to reinforce the body materials, which occasionally is helpful if using weak or easily breakable body materials. Note again that I have the ribbing material on the near side of the hook, so the first wrap starts under the shank, which gives a neater fly. I then continue wrapping, exchanging hands and keeping the thread out of the way, very similar to what you saw with wrapping body materials forward. I also tie off very similar to body materials. Be sure not to cut the wire with your good scissors. Either break it off if it's thin wire or use your secondary scissors. A distribution wrap ties in material and wraps the material at the same time. It's done most frequently on a small wet fly when you can't find a proper size hackle to wind in the conventional manner. On a size 12 hook, this usually isn't a problem, but for demonstration, I'm using a size 12 hook and a large black wet fly hackle. You can see that if I would wind this hackle in the usual fashion, the fibers would be way too long. By cutting the stem in a little ways from the tip, I get a small notch. I can then aggregate the fibers into a vertical group and pinch the fibers tightly to the far side of the hook, placing them for proper length. I then switch hands, pinch them with my left hand, and use the thread tension placement and tie-in that we used in part 2 by keeping the tension on the thread as I let the thread distribute the fibers around the hook shank. Usually, this is most easily done on a bare hook shank. Remember the bare hook shank we saved while putting the thread in part 1 in this series? I usually put a few thread wraps just in front of the remaining stem to stand it up, and then cut off or occasionally break off the remaining hackle stem and fibers. This can take a little practice to get it right. Most commonly it works best for me by putting the top of the fibers even with the top of the hook shank and on the far side, but some prefer to pinch the bundle on the near side. Experiment and see what works best for you. Tying on a beard or throat is somewhat similar to doing a distribution wrap. You could, of course, tie the materials directly in at the bottom of the hook, but usually it's faster to place the bundle of fibers you want as a beard on the far side of the hook and let the thread tension distribute them to the bottom of the hook. Once distributed, you can loosen the thread, make minor adjustments, and retighten your thread and finish the tie-in wraps. We've already put on a caddis, which is a down wing, in part 2, so now we'll put on an upright wing, which is common in Mayfly patterns or used as a post in many patterns. Before putting any wing on, be sure that there's a thread base or other material so your wing won't slip around the hook. Putting the tip of the wing to your right, measure for length or leave the wing a little long if you can cut the material off later, such as with this polypropylene. Wind your thread to the placement point and use your placement wrap carefully. If not in the correct location, undo your placement wrap and start again. Once you're comfortable with the placement, add some tie-in wraps and then, still holding the excess wing material tightly, raise it to about 45 degrees and cut off with a near-level scissors, giving a taper to the excess. Bind the remaining stub down and move your thread to the front of the wing to build a thread block to hold the wing upright. To build a thread block, you make a taper of thread with the high end at the base of the wing. Don't try to put all your thread wraps just at the base or they will slip. At this point, you could split the wing if wanted, but most modern Mayfly patterns use a single wing. If you're making a fly with a parachute hackle, you'll need to post up the wing by winding the thread around the base of the wing. This is easier with a rotary vise by turning the fly upside down, but can be done by carefully winding with a loose wrap around the base and then pulling the thread tight while you hold the top of the wing, also known as a post at this time. Create a thread base on the wing by winding up and then back down, putting in about 10 wraps or more. The thread should finish the front of the base of the post on the near side of the hook. The height of the base will vary by fly pattern, but generally will be about 1 to 2 eye lengths high. Most commonly, you post up a wing when you're using a parachute hackle, so let's attach and wind a parachute hackle. Be sure the length of bare stem on the hackle is adequate to attach the hackle to the hook and to the post without wrapping the fibers into your thread. The side of the hackle that you want down should be facing away from you as you use a tight line technique to attach the hackle stem to the hook in front of the posted wing. Wind your thread back until the hackle stem is tight against the post and then wind the stem up the post to the top of the thread base. Then wind the thread back down, finishing with the thread hanging in front of and tight behind the post on the near side of the hook. Wind the hackle, usually clockwise, starting at the top, with each successive wrap being below the previous wrap until you get to the base. Usually this will be about 4 to 6 wraps. If the fibers, like here, start to flare, you've taken one too many wraps. I tie off the hackle on the base of the post, being careful not to catch the fibers, and then move my thread forward to finish the head of the fly as I hold the hackle fibers up. Once the fly is complete, I cut the excess hackle from below. I also cut the excess thread if I'm done with the fly and rearrange the hackle fibers as needed, cutting a few of the out-of-place fibers that flared if necessary. The wing can then be cut to length as desired. A poly-spent spinner wing is also quite common. A spent spinner wing is flat and perpendicular to the hook shank. Multiple materials can be used, with polypropylene being very common. Cut your wing slightly longer than needed and place on top of the hook. Put 2 slightly loose wraps over the material at the placement point. Get the wing perpendicular to the hook shank by pulling the front part back towards you and the back part forward away from you. While holding the wing towards you, put 2 wraps from front to back, making a cross over the wing. Tighten these wraps and then add figure 8 wraps if desired. You can put dubbing on the thread and add more wraps to make a nice thorax. Trim the wings to the desired length. We've tied in and off all our materials and are almost done with the fly, so let's finish it. To finish the fly, add thread wraps just behind the hook eye for the head. You can make a very small to a very large head depending on the pattern and your preferences. Then tie off the thread. You can use several half hitches, as I'm doing here, but I prefer to use a whip finisher as shown here. You can do a whip finish by hand, but it's much easier with the proper tool. First, I usually use 3 rotations to be sure I can pull the thread tight. Then I can use 3 or more rotations. After whip finishing twice like this, I find I don't need to use head cement, so I don't have to worry about keeping the hook eye clean of head cement. Cut the thread and then check to be sure the eye is clear, as in finishing hooks, manufacturers sometimes leave varnish in the eye, and you don't want to have trouble tying your tippet in out on the stream. In this short series for beginning fly tyers, we've covered handling thread, placing and tying in materials, handling materials on the hook, forward and reverse winding, and handling common wings, tying off materials, being sure to cut the excess material above the hook so you don't accidentally cut the thread, and finishing the fly. There are more techniques to learn, but these should give you a good start in the hobby of fly tying. When tying most flies, you'll commonly put the tail in first and work forward, but there are exceptions where you'll want to put in the wing first. Tie the same pattern multiple times. The 6th time will generally be far better than the 1st, and the 12th better yet. If you wouldn't fish with the early flies that you tie because they're too sloppy, cut off the materials now with a single edge razor blade and start again on that hook. Practice techniques that you're having problems with. Watch other tyers on the internet, paying specific attention to the techniques you have problems with, and when you get the opportunity, watch other tyers in person and ask questions, particularly about any problems you may be having. So now if you have equipment and materials, look up videos of favorite fly patterns on the internet and start tying. You may also want to view my series on simple entomology for the fly tyer and fly fisherman, where I do tie some simple trout flies. Especially if you have a rotary vise, view my series on rotary vise techniques, where you'll learn some simple techniques that will save you time and help you make better flies. If you don't yet have equipment or materials, join me for the final video in this series, where we'll briefly discuss the equipment and material you'll need and help you make some decisions about possible purchases.